Let's record. Recording in progress. So welcome back. This half, we're going to go over light intensity versus exposure. We're going to do some basic light demos. Very simple polyplane with 3 spheres. You can follow along if you want to. We're just going to go over the properties of the directional light, the point light, the spotlight, and the AI Arnold area light. That is the only light that we would consider to be physical because you can scale it and the shadows in the scene will react to that light. The others are basic Maya lights with Arnold attributes. Consequently, if they are Maya lights, they don't scale. You'll scale the icon, but that's about all you'll do. All right, so light intensity versus exposure. The projector screen is frozen. Good, thank you. All right, so that's where we were. That's where we're at now. Good. All right, so light intensity versus exposure. So in the Arnold area light, you will see light exposure nestled right underneath intensity. In any of the other Maya lights, directional light, point light, spotlight, exposure is tucked away under the Arnold attribute. Now, the difference between the two is light intensity is what we call linear. You can get from point A to point B from 0 to 1 by going through a whole bunch of steps. Light exposure is technically operating like a camera. It is a multiplier. If anybody's ever done any camera work or ever worked with a camera where you can set the shutter opening, the shutter speed, basically an aperture opening is exposure. You open it, it opens it twice the size that it was before, or it makes it twice as small, letting half the light in. It's really meant to be a multiplier. Now, linear, each step is evenly spaced, no large jumps. Real light works this way. Exposure, it is designed to exponentially increase your light, just like the shutter opening in a camera. It increases it by the power of 2. So specifically, it corresponds to the f-stop of a camera, allowing a certain amount of light to hit your sensor. Now, real world intensity, we usually measure the amount of light in lumens. You go to buy a light bulb, on the side of the box, it'll tell you how many lumens it is. 60-watt light bulb, if you go to the store, it's usually about 800 lumens. 100-watt light bulb, somewhere between 1100 and 1200 lumens. 500-watt light bulbs, closer to like 9,500, 10,000 lumens. These are big numbers. Get used to big numbers, because in order to understand light, you need to understand how much intensity or how much energy is needed in a scene. Don't be lulled into a false sense of, oh, it's got to be 0 to 1. Or if I go above 10, oh my God, something bad is going to happen. No, because real world light operates with big numbers of energy. All right, so kind of a simple way to demonstrate how intensity versus exposure works. Let me bring up my calculator. And this is just simple basic math. So if I have an intensity of 100 in my scene, just an arbitrary number, could be 1,000, doesn't really matter, 100. And I want to increase that a little bit, I can go like to 100.1. So got 100 units. If I increase it just a little bit, I can do that just by using intensity. Now, if I'm using exposure, exposure is a multiplier. All right, so we have 100 and I want to add just a little bit. Oops, wrong thing. 100, I can add just a little bit. That'll give me 100.1. Now, multiplier, you guys know if you multiply a number by 1, what do you get? The same number. So when exposure happens, exposure works like this: 100 times 1.1, right? If I multiply by 1, it's going to give me 100. If I want to increase it to 0.1, well, in multiply, I multiply by 1.1, I come out with 110, right? 110 is a whole lot more than 101, 100.1. So you want that fine adjustment in intensity. You don't want to touch that exposure and have your lighting jump. Most people think that you turn up exposure and then you tweak it with the individual light intensity. No, because that's not how real light works. Like I said, if you go to the store, you're buying a 100-watt light bulb, you're buying 1100 lumens, right? You're not buying an exposure of 50 times 2 lumens. So just so you can understand how this works, in our class, we don't use exposure at all. Get used to just adjusting the intensity. Because honestly, in photography, the only exposure is the shutter opening, right? That lets light in. But when the photographer uses light, they don't use exposure, they use wattage, or whatever the illumination level is. Some adjustable lights have a rotary potentiometer, you can adjust it up and down, but a lot of lights are fixed. Usually 500 watt, 1000, 1200, 1500, 2K, that's how they measure lights in wattage. So does that make sense? So stick with intensity. You can't go wrong in our class. Now, you may go into another class and they want you to use exposure. Fine, go ahead. But just know, in the real world, we're trying to be as accurate as we can so you guys understand how stuff works. So intensity is actually the way to go. Now, there's all kinds of arguments back and forth in the whole CG community about this. I land on the side of exposure. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't necessarily say you can't use exposure, but the way we normally use exposure is you have a whole bunch of lights set up in your scene and you set the exposure for your entire scene. Does it need to look twice as bright, the whole scene, or does it need to look half as bright? You can adjust it with exposure when everything else individually is adjusted. And usually that is something that the lighting director at the very end will do, or even just the director of photography or your, whoever your production manager is. They may have say, oh, great job lighting, just bring everything down a little bit. And that's where you would use exposure for the whole thing. And they may actually do it in the camera, because you can do it in the camera in Unreal. You can adjust the exposure of the camera and it just brings everything down. It brings everything up. That is a really good use of exposure, because then it's behaving like the real world does. And nowadays, with everything going into digital production, I mean, the big thing in virtual production now is people using their iPhones as cameras. They've got them mounted. They can go in, tie it into Unreal, and they can move their phone around and it will move the camera around in the scene. They go in, adjust the slider on their phone, that'll adjust the exposure of the camera in Unreal. So, I mean, it's a great thing. But again, just remember, exposure is multiplying whatever you have in intensity. So, in this exercise for today, don't be afraid if you go into the hundreds for light intensity. If you walked into this room and it were completely dark, right? That means nighttime, windows are blocked, no lights on, nothing. If you walked in with a candle, would you be able to see a whole lot? No. If you walked in with a match, you'd be able to see even less. You walk in with a big floodlight, you'll be able to see a lot. So just think of it like that. You've got a room, you want it to be bright. When you initially get Maya's lights, they're usually at an intensity of 1, which is barely noticeable. So you need to crank it up, and don't get upset with numbers. Just crank it up until you can see it. Because a lot of times when you start lighting, you got to have it bright enough before you can figure out the light direction. So crank it up, even if it's ridiculously bright, just get it bright enough so you can see where those shadows are being cast. And then you can start to go in and do the rest, refine it, get your light direction, then adjust the intensity, adjust the color if it's there, and then work on shadows. Questions? Make sense? All right. So before we do this, let's kind of go over the exercises we're going to be doing. Go back here. Oh, that was quick. Okay, I like that. That worked out good. The first part of lecture is up. Second part, we are recording? Yes, we are. Good. All right, so today we are working with the principles of light. We are going to give you a couple of scene files. So we already went over, got some reading for you guys. All right, some things to consider when you get started. Don't forget, you're going to be working with a Maya project folder structure. So launch Maya, set your project to the project folder we give you, then open your scene file. You want to make sure in your lights, under the Arnold attribute, you want to make sure shadows is turned on. It should be by default. But the reason I mention this, and sometimes it drives people crazy, is because if you get a scene from somebody else, you don't know what they've done to the lights. So always make sure your shadows are turned on, because if not, you're going to get really weird results with your lights. You're not going to have any shadows in them. All right. Each render will be a different basic light and contain a different light direction. Obviously, you're going to use IPR. I'm going to show you how to bring the reference images into the Arnold render view, just like you did for project 1. And you can start trying to figure out, hey, do my shadows match up with the reference shadows? Because today it's all about lighting. If you use color and light, you want to keep the value in the color. Remember, Maya uses hue, saturation, and value. Hue is the color, saturation, the dominance of the color, and value is lightness and darkness. So you want to keep your value close to 1. You want a pure color. Keep the saturation low because lights will saturate very quickly, meaning they get very cartoony and the light becomes like stylized caricature of real light. Whereas we're trying to be a little more subtle. On all your geometry, when you open your scene up, you will need to assign an AI standard material to all of the geometry. This is going to be from here on out. We give you a new scene, assume, unless we tell you otherwise, it doesn't have anything but Lambert on there. So your job will be to assign the AI standard, and we have a couple of settings to change in the Arnold material. One is you want to turn off the specular weight. We don't want shiny in our scene. We're going to use the default base color, no shiny. So specular weight gets turned off. And in the base section, the base color value is going to be 0.5 or 50% gray. By default, it's set to 0.8, which is very close to being white. So Arnold by default has a really weird sense of what neutral is. All right, so I'm going to go over that several more times, but just remember, you don't want to use the default Lambert material. It is awful, and it doesn't really respond to the light in the proper way. All of your assignments from project 1 had this material assigned to it by default. They had the same properties. All right, so we've got 4 exercises that you're going to do. You've got some choice here. We're going to be doing a front light, and that will be using the AI or Arnold area light. You've got 2 choices. You can do either the front or you can do the top light. Doesn't really matter. And you can see same geometry, same composition. The only difference really is the light direction and light color, light intensity. So you choose one of those. Whichever one you choose determines what your next choice will be for the directional light, because you need to do the opposite direction that you chose to do in the Arnold area light. So for example, somebody pick one, doesn't matter, I'm not going to hold you to it. All right, so if you choose to do the front light here, you have to do the top light in the directional. And vice versa. If you choose to do the top light here, you will need to do the front light in the directional light. Because opposite light, opposite direction, or not opposite light, but different light, different direction. So that is half of your exercise. The other half will utilize, one of the scenes will utilize the same scene file. So for the point light, you have a choice of either doing side light or backlight. Whichever one you choose here will decide for the spotlight. And you'll notice, oh, all of a sudden, spotlight, different geometry, different scene file. Why? Because I got bored. So spotlight will be determined by what you chose to do in the point light exercise. Does that make sense? So whichever one you decide to do here, somebody pick one, it doesn't really matter. Side light. So if you choose side light here, you got to do backlight for the spot. And again, if you choose backlight for the point, you got to do side light for the spot. So each light has a different light direction. That's for the 4 main parts of your assignment. The 5th part, which is the My Comp, you're going to look for some photo reference off the internet. Avoid animation, avoid CG. We're going for photo reference. Why? Theoretically, real world, real lights, real camera. All right, so in this composition, you're going to be choosing one of our scenes. You can duplicate it. You can scale the geometry in there. You can do anything but model or import something from another scene. You are responsible for the lighting, but only a single light source. Create a new camera, just like you did in project 1. Work with the focal length like you did in project 1. Get an idea for what am I looking at? Does it look like it's telephoto, like it's a long distance away and it's magnified? Does it look like it's really close and expansive? Could be a wide angle lens, or it could be a normal lens. Use only one light. Keep it simple. Capture the overall look and feel of your reference like you did in the first assignment. You can move, like I said, scale geometry, duplicate it, hide it, do what you need, but you can't model anything or import any geometry from another scene. All right, let me show you some examples of what previous classes have done. So film noir, like I said, works pretty well. You can really get a basic idea of composition with its simple geometry. Don't worry about like sky and stuff like that. We're not dealing with sky. We're just dealing with light. You can see they got the trees. That's really sort of side light, right? Shadows are going left to right in the screen. Whole bunch of tiny little blocks with light on the other side, light passing through all these little blocks, creating those blind-like shadows. Now, the fact that we don't have a backlight, don't let that bother you. This captures the look and feel even without that. Oh yeah, film noir, everybody smokes, everybody drinks. So just so you get an idea. Don't condone it, it's just a fact of the genre. So this one, those shadows are fairly parallel. Here, light direction, looks like it's mostly overhead. A little bit of light falls on the face. We're looking for the look and feel of it. This one. Oh, and one other thing, don't be afraid of light intensity, because a lot of times students will think, oh, that's pretty good. It really could be a whole lot brighter. And brighter, the clue here is look at the contrast between the light areas and the dark areas. Here, not much contrast. It's kind of too soft. It blends in too much with the rest of it. Backlight, that's basically what this is, could be brighter. Not everything I'm showing you is a winner. We can always learn from things that almost work, but not quite. This one, they actually did a pretty good job of establishing foreground, midground, and background, all without those God rays, right? We don't do them in our class. That's a volumetric lighting effect, and that is well beyond what we can do here in this class. But you can see foreground, silhouette. Everything is, all the lights behind that foreground element. Midground, providing our main staging area where the shadows are. And then we have background elements that are just that. They are in the background. So we establish that whole layer of depth there. Again, light could be a little bit brighter, but overall captures will look and feel pretty good. Very simple, but it works. Not everything has to be complicated. Or this, you could spend a lot of time and make it really complicated. Choice is yours. All right, does that help? Questions? All right, so there's 5 parts to this exercise. They're each worth 20% of the grade. So it's pretty even. We're going to assume you can give us a professional or a production quality level of render, and make sure you nail all the professionalism stuff. Make sure you get, and this is project professionalism, by the way, none of it has to do with GPS. Project professionalism is, did you submit the right parts of the assignment? Are they named correctly? Are they in the right format? Are the images snapped into place? All of that is basically your delivery. How is your project delivered to the client? Question? Yes.
I don't know if you just have like the references, I guess, like color coordinated to show us that we're supposed to do the opposite ones, but do you want the same colors?
Yes, you are matching everything you see,
Okay.
unless we tell you otherwise.
Okay.
So always assume if we give you this, you've got light direction, light intensity. Oh yeah, there's color there. The one next to it. Oh yeah, it looks like there's color there. How about the one down here? Well, it doesn't look like it's got the same kind of color. This one could be white light. Always start with white light. Get everything in, then add color. That's really, go in the order that the principles of light are. If you go by direction, intensity, then color, then shadow quality, you can't go wrong. That will work for anything. Now, a lot of times with that kind of cyan or that kind of magenta, pinky color, that kind of hits you over the head. But the other colors, where it's just a little bit warmer, that's going to be a little more subtle. Like the difference between these two, hopefully you can see that, well, the one on the right looks like it could have a little extra something in there. Good question. Any others? Everybody good? All right, so let's do a demo. And for this, I'm just going to use a simple, like I said, polyplane, 3 spheres. And I use 3 spheres just because it's simple, quick geometry to render. And it shows me how my light pattern spreads with multiple geometry. So I have to wait for Arnold to load. All right, so let's create a polyplane. I'm just going to make it fill up the entire grid. Create a couple of, well, I'm going to create one sphere. Let's pull it up out of the ground because there's nothing worse than looking at something inside the geometry. If you raise it up a unit, the standard size of that sphere, it's going to sit on the ground. So let's go in and let's duplicate it. All right, so the first thing you want to do, select all your geometry. You can do that a couple of ways. Marquee select everything in the viewport or go into the outliner selected. And what is a quick way to assign a new material? Yep, you can right click and you can go assign new material. What else can you do? Well, another way is if anybody's familiar with the hypershade, you can actually open up the hypershade, make a new material, assign it out of the hypershade. You right click on it, again, right clicking, assign material. If you're lazy like I am, I like to just select the geometry and do Shift T. T is in Tango. Shift T in the viewport will bring up the assign new material window. Very similar to what you get if you right click and go assign new material. You want to go down to Arnold. And in this Arnold list, you want to choose AI standard surface. This is the Swiss Army knife of materials. With this, you can create virtually anything from skin to rubber, to concrete, to wood, to plastic, to metal, to glass. AI standard surface. Now, all of these objects have the same AI standard surface on it. So it doesn't matter which one I choose, it's going to change the attribute for all of them because they all have the same material. Now, in the AI standard surface, when you make a new one, first thing you want to do, turn off specular weight. Specular is right under base. Take weight, turn the slider to 0. Now, no more shine. Second, under base color, if you click on the color swatch, go into the value attribute. Notice it's set at 0.8. That's like 80%, which is really close to being pretty white. We want to go 0.5. That will give you 50% gray. Basic neutral standard value. Does that make sense? So create a new AI standard surface. Quick way, select your geometry, do Shift T. T is in Tango. When you create the new material, specular weight to 0, base color, value 0.5. Now you're ready to start playing with lights. So which one do you want to see first? You got directional, point, spot, area. Okay, we got one directional. Anybody else? We got one point. Got one area. Ooh, we got 2 points. That's only half the class. Oh, we got directional. We got 2. Ooh, another point. It's getting close. Got 2 more. Okay, got another area. One more. Who didn't vote? Alex? You got a choice?
Oh, like thinking what light we use.
No, which light I'm going to demo for you.
Um,
So we got one spot. All right, well, by default, point light wins. Close second, directional, area, and then spotlight at the end. All right, so let's do point light first. Point light is a very simple Maya light. Now, all of your lights except the Arnold area light are in the Create menu under Lights. The Arnold area light can only be gotten from this icon right here. If you hover above it, it says Create area light. Now, there is an area light here. It's a Maya area light, but it does not behave the same way as the Arnold area light does, even though it has Arnold attributes. It doesn't wrap around the subject accurately like the Arnold area light does from the beginning. So we always make a distinction. Out of all the lights, it's always going to be an Arnold area light. And Arnold does not have its own version of directional or point or spot. So we have to use the Mayas and then use the Arnold adjustments or the Arnold attributes. So lights, point. I've got a point light in there. I've got two of my three, actually, I've got all three things in there. I've got a camera. I'm looking through the perspective. I've got geometry and I've got light. I've got all the makings of a render. So let's open up the Arnold render view and let's render. All right, so looks great. Well, we got a couple of issues. One, the light is buried inside the geometry. So let's pull it out. There we go. So notice the closer the light is to the object, it's bright, but it really does not cast a lot of light in the scene. So this is where you want to come in and start cranking up your intensity. So 10, 100. Honestly, 100 is usually my starting point for the Maya lights. Now, by default, notice that we get a light pattern that kind of fans out. All the shadows are not underneath all the objects. In the middle, where the light is, the shadow will be planted underneath. But this point light is really an omnidirectional bare light bulb, shining in all directions. So, direction, simply change the direction of the light, it will change your shadows. So, light coming in from above, light coming in sort of from the front, sort of from the sides, sort of from the back, looks much more dramatic this way. From the back, you get an idea. Does that make sense so far? Now, we talk about light direction, pretty simple. Light intensity, you got to crank up the intensity, obviously, to be able to see it. So you can work with it. Light color, well, that's pretty simple. The color attribute for the light. So if I come in and I go, well, let's make it sort of yellowy. Or let's cool it off a little. if you turn up the saturation level too much, it really becomes super saturated, like oversaturated. You're much better off going below 0.5. Honestly, I usually start around 0.3 and work my way down. Because most of the time, you don't want to hit people over the head with light color. You know, unless you're doing something like a special photography shoot where they throw what are called gels in front of the light. Oh, I want like red light to do a special fill, or I want blue light for the backdrop. If you see that, well, that's what you can do here. But most of the time, light color is not going to be that saturated. Now, a quick way to get your light color back to white or neutral, if you take the light color slider in your light and drag it left and right, it will basically reset it back to white. Also, one other thing with white light, don't get in the habit of doing this, because that looks like you're playing with the light intensity, but you're giving yourself artificial darkness because you're basically changing the color of the light and not the intensity. So you can get into trouble doing that too. So even if you pick a color, say you pick blue, right? Notice how dark that blue is. It looks like it's not as bright. Same intensity, but the color is super saturated. Now, if I turn the value down, that'll give me a darker blue, but it looks like I don't have as much intensity. So always keep your light color value as close to 1 as possible. Keep your saturation level. This is going to change the dominance of that color. And then, like I said, you can always reset it. All right, does that make sense so far? Now, the one thing we haven't touched on is shadows. So right now, by default, you get these razor sharp shadows. Even if I take my light and I move it really far away, or move it super close. Looks like I translated it way too much. There we go. So notice I can put it really close, which you would think, oh, well, big light source or light really close to the geometry, that should be making my shadows softer. No, because they're Maya lights. The point light is technically an infinitely small point of light in space. So it's always going to have hard shadow edges. The way we soften them up is in the Arnold attribute. So if you go into the attribute editor, go down to Arnold, and you'll see there is a little control called radius. This gives the light an actual physical size. So right now, with the radius of 0, it's always going to give you razor sharp shadows. It's infinitely small, it's a hard light. As I start to increase this, let's go to like 0.1. Not much, but a little bit. Let's start cranking it up. You can see I get to like 0.5. My shadows have softened quite a bit. And oh, let's get some more intensity in here. There we go. All right, so radius controls, this is at 0. And let's go like 0.2, maybe 0.3. That'll give you a good idea. That's very subtle softness. You need more. Crank it up till it matches your reference. Does that make sense? So for the point light direction, obviously it's the translation, the position of the light. Doesn't matter if you rotate that point light. Why? It's a ball. It's infinitely small and it is omnidirectional. Translation matters. Scale does not matter. You can scale it all day long and it's not even going to change the icon. But shadow softness under the Arnold attribute, that is the radius control to give you a physical size. Good. Now, couple things about most of the lights you can make visible to the camera, except for the directional light. That one is going to look, you're not going to be able to see it because it's going to be super far away. It's meant to be an infinitely distant light. So let me drop the radius down on this. And in the attribute editor, down still under the Arnold attributes, you scroll down under visibility, there is visible or visibility for the camera. By default, it's set at 0, which means that light is not seen by the camera. If you want it to be seen, you just turn it to 1 and you go, okay, ha ha ha. I turned it on, but why can't I see it in my scene? Remember, it's infinitely small right now. I turned my radius all the way to 0. If I want to make that light visible, it's got to have size. So as soon as I start turning up the radius, it becomes visible. You guys see that? Now, one of the things you have to watch out for is making it too big, because then it swallows up your scene. And if it's not visible to the camera, you get that. You've actually taken a bite out of the top sphere. Now, it's a good tool to know about for the film noir, because sometimes in film noir, you need to see the light and you need to see the effect of the light. And you can kind of get a twofer right there. Because a lot of times in a film shoot or a photography session, you'll have what's called a practical light, which is a light there just to be visible to the camera. It doesn't really provide much in the scene. And then you'll have lights that actually provide illumination. Well, here you can get the best of both with a single light. Does that make sense? All right. Questions? Yes. Yes, there are. Yeah, it's the one that should say, I think it says area der point. Use the same scene for the 3 lights, and then the spotlight has its own scene. Right, 2 scenes, but if you look at 3 of the scenes, use the same geometry and the same camera, the same render cam. And I'm going to go over that when I actually open the scene up and kind of go through the workflow that I want you guys to do. But right now, I just want to try and get across how these lights behave and what to expect. All right, so questions about the point light? So just remember, to make the shadows softer, you have to go under the Arnold attribute. In the point light attributes, go under Arnold, go to the radius attribute to give it a physical size. All right, so let's get rid of that point light. Now, if I render again, I got nothing. Starting over. All right, so directional or area? One area, 2, 3, 4, sold. All right, so let's go under area. Now, for this, you will not be using the Maya lights from the create menu. You will go in the Arnold shelf. The very first icon on the left will create an Arnold area light. There it is in all its Arnold glory. Just like anything else that you create gets dropped in where? Center of the world, center of the grid. Now, if I render this out, I can see a little swatch of light there. Really not a whole lot. Well, mostly because, again, the light is embedded inside the geometry. So let's translate that out. Back, let's pull this over. And you can see, again, by default, too dim. You can't really see anything. So when you create a light, don't feel, intimidated by cranking up the intensity. I know we say light direction first, but you got to be able to see the light in order to figure out where the direction is. So crank it up a bit. Like I said, I usually start at 100 and then work my way up or down. Now, notice this light does not illuminate anything behind it. It's got a little, looks like a normal, but it's a pointer. That pointer tells you the direction the light is broadcasting. Nothing gets broadcast behind it. Notice this light automatically gives you soft shadows. That's because this is our physical light. Let me crank it up a little bit more. So it's a physical light. What happens if I make that light physically smaller? Let's scale it. Look what happens to my shadows. They got contracted. They got harder. If I make the light bigger, my shadows get softer. Soft shadows are going to take a while to clean up because you got a lot of noise. You've spread out that shadow across a larger area. So it's got some cleanup work to do. Now, translation matters, scale matters, and actually so does rotation. Funny thing about this, translation doesn't really affect the shadows all that much. When you physically move it and then rotate it, that's when you get the most effect out of it. It's got to do with the positionality of the light. This is one of the few software pieces or software programs that you'll run into that does this. Most of them, if you rotate the light, it rotates the direction also. But Arnold, you got to do both. You got to translate it and then rotate it in order for the position to actually change. So this changes the position of my shadows. And then if I want my light pattern to match my shadows, well, I got to rotate it like that. All right, does that make sense? Question? All right, so in the Arnold attributes of this light, let's make the light visible. Now, you have to understand that the pointer of the light needs to be aimed at the camera in order for the light to be visible. So if I rotate this light around, you can't see it anymore. Now, this light by default is called a quad. That's the shape of it. It's a flat plane. You also have the choice of disc, which gives you a round looking light, sort of similar to a sphere light, but notice it does not illuminate anything behind it, but it does make an interesting shape. And the shadows are slightly different. So let's save the shadows from here. Let's change it back to a quad. Very, very subtle difference in the edge or outer band of the shadows. I don't know if you guys can see that. Move this over here. Maybe that's a little better. Right in the outer areas right here. Now, in addition to a quad, which is honestly the most used shape, followed by the disc, there is also a cylinder. Now, the trouble with the cylinder is it's got a void in the center, which means it's an open-ended cylinder. And no, you can't cap it off. You can't add geometry to it. In fact, you know, all you can do is rotate it. And if it's visible to the camera and you do this, it disappears. So the cylinder is okay. The thing about the cylinder is it will shine light in all directions. You don't get that cutoff that you do with the quad or the disc. Right? I could move this into the center of the scene. And basically it will illuminate in all directions. Honestly, I don't really show that light this light that often, because when we get into using environment lighting, we're going to get into creating mesh lights, which is taking a piece of geometry, any piece of geometry, and turning it into a light. So it's a lot more effective to do that than try to use a cylinder. Cylinder has very limited uses. In fact, in the real world, you're not going to find a cylindrical light unless you get into special illumination. Most of the time, it's going to be a flat quad, which is basically called a softbox, or it's going to be a disc shape. Those are going to be the common shapes you're going to run into. So I would say keep it to quad or disc. Quad for now. We'll get into using the disc light next lecture when we start dealing with portraits. All right, so light direction, Pretty simple. Translate the light, rotate the light into position. Intensity, fairly simple. Turn up the intensity. Color, add color just like you would for the point light. Make it visible to the camera. And you can even change the shape. Quad and disc are probably the most common, quad being the first. Questions? All right, let's delete that. Let's go to directional, and then we'll get into the spot. So directional light, very simply, is meant to mimic the sun. You can tell by looking at the icon. Parallel arrows. This light, unlike all the others, is meant to act like it is infinitely far away. Whatever direction those arrows are pointed, there is a wall of light going in that direction, just like the sun. All right, so let's create a directional light. For this, we got to go up to the Create menu, Lights, Directional. Now, by default, dropped in at the center of the world. Let's hit Render. And you can see that we have a sphere on the left being illuminated. So just like all the other lights, it dropped in at the center of the world. And you say to yourself, okay, good. Well, the reason you're not seeing the rest of the geometry is because it's embedded in the geometry, or, it's embedded inside that middle sphere. So let me pull that up out of the ground. I can translate it any direction, and it's not going to change. I can even put it on the other side, and it's not going to change. Why? Say again? Yeah, it's a wall of light coming from the left side. Whatever direction those arrows are pointed, it's a wall of light. The reason you can't see any of the other geometry is because it is perfectly lined up with that first sphere. No matter where I translate it, that light's going to hit that sphere, and that sphere is going to create a shadow on the others. So this light, translation means absolutely nothing. This light is all about rotation. Parallel light rays, parallel shadows. Again, doesn't matter where I translate this to, it's that direction or angle that the light's coming from that dictates what's visible. Questions? Make sense? Now, by default, you're going to have hard edge shadows. Doesn't matter what angle you rotate this. And notice that it does look a little brighter the more light rays you have hit that ground. Now, this is one of the few lights where an intensity of 1 is actually not too bad. All right, now the sun has hard shadows, but they're not razor sharp like this directional light has by default. Under the Arnold attribute, there is an attribute called angle. This is related to the angle of the sun. The steeper the angle of the sun, the softer your shadows are going to be. Now, most software packages, and I'll go as far as to say Arnold, well, Arnold has 0 for the angle, but RenderMan and V-Ray both start off with a light angle of 0.5. In fact, in the Arnold docs, they recommend you keep the light angle around 0.5 because that behaves a lot like the sun does. So you turn this to 0.5, doesn't really change the shadows all that much. But what happens is that the longer the shadows get, the softer those shadows become. So now you can start to see when they get really long, they start to get a lot softer. When the shadows are tucked right under the object, they're going to act like the sun and be very, very hard looking, but not completely razor sharp. So for the directional light, activate under the Arnold attributes, the angle, make it 0.5. That'll give you pretty decent, accurate sun shadows at any angle. Now, notice you can't make this light visible to the camera. Why? I don't know. They could have done it. Other software packages do it. They chose not to. Change your color exactly the same way. Translation doesn't matter. It's all about rotation. You can, now this light, you can actually scale the icon, which is useful because sometimes you'll bring it into a scene and the scene will be gigantic and the light will come in looking like a little tiny fly. And you can make it bigger so it works in the scene and it's easier to move around. But you're not really changing anything other than aesthetically, it's easier for you to work with. So physical scale on this only scales the icon. Turn up the angle. That will give you soft shadows based on how much of a rotation angle you have. It gets softer. Questions? All right, so the very last light we're going to do is going to be the spotlight. So the spotlight is a very interesting light. Spotlight you create in the Maya menu set. So create lights and you go to spotlight. Now, by default, you will get a spotlight at the center of the world, render, that's what you get. So let's translate it up out of the ground. This you will have to translate and rotate into position. Notice it is very bleak and dark. Why? Because the intensity is ridiculously low. So that cone works just like a stage spotlight does. If you've ever seen a comedian or a performer walk around on stage, they always have a spotlight following. So intensity works the same way. Translation, rotation works the same way. Scale, scale's the icon, but that's about it. It does not change your shadows. We can change the shadows under the Arnold attribute. And you'll notice it's got a radius control just like the point light. So the spotlight and the point light start off like exactly the same way. So we have a point light, infinitely small point in space. We have a spotlight. The only difference is the point light is omnidirectional, all directions. The spotlight funnels all of the light through a cone. So it acts like a flashlight, car headlights, projector, projecting light in that direction. More focused because of that cone right here. Now, the reason I mention all of this is because the radius of the spotlight is 0, just like the point light, giving you razor sharp shadows. So you need to increase the radius to soften the shadows. But notice it only softens the shadows and not the edge of the cone. That is a separate control. So for the spotlight, there are 3 extra controls that you use. So let me lower that radius down a little bit. And the controls you want to use are the cone angle, and the cone angle and the penumbra angle. Penumbra angle is the softness of the cone edge. So cone angle is in degrees. So 40 degrees is the throw pattern of this spotlight, which is not quite 45. It's about like that. You know, whereas 90 degrees would be something like this, a pretty wide cone. Notice as I increase the cone angle, it covers more area. And if I make it like almost 180 degrees, it becomes a flat disc, basically. Don't ever use a spotlight like that. It just is dreadful. So we get to around 90 degrees. That's a pretty big cone. That's going to cover a lot of area. Usually with a spotlight, you know, you want to keep it to a specific area. That's why you use a spotlight. It's got clear direction and clear definition to the edges. So cone angle will adjust the size of the cone, that's being broadcast. Penumbra angle will adjust the softness. Now notice the penumbra angle controls in the middle. So if I drag it to the right, it will extend my cone and make it softer outwards. If I drag it to the left, it will make the cone smaller and soften it inwards. Common question is, can you make the cone smaller and make, the penumbra bigger, or make the cone bigger, make the penumbra smaller, you get the same effect. Honestly, you're back at the same point. It depends on, I guess, how you think about it. But usually I like to figure out where the cone is and then soften it either inwards or outwards, depending on what I'm doing. Most of the time, I'm going to show you guys that it's easier to soften it inwards sometimes. Because you can kind of see, like I can see where the outer edges are. That's the size of the cone I want. But if I soften it outwards, that means I got to make this smaller. So I find it easier just to make the cone the size I need it. And then, okay, if it's soft, does it soften inwards or soften outwards? Most of the time, it looks like it's going to contract a little. You might see something like that. All right, now, the next control is called drop off. Notice that the intensity inside this cone, let me crank it up a little, is fairly even. It's a little brighter over here on the edge, but it's fairly even throughout the cone. Drop off works just like a flashlight, where it's bright in the center and that reflector that's all around the spotlight or the flashlight will kind of soften or have the light get less intense. So think of drop off as keeping the light bright in the center, but gradually getting less intense toward the edges. So even if I just breathe on this, it's pretty sensitive. Like I can just barely move that slider. So most of the time, I wouldn't even use the slider, just kind of type in the numbers. You can see it's staying bright in the center, but gradually getting less intense toward the edges. It almost acts like cone and penumbra at the same time. But you got to be really careful with that. Because you can quickly run out of cone. You can't make it any bigger. And there are times when you want to have soft cone edges, but you don't necessarily want to focus the light in the center. So that's why you can use, this method. It stays pretty even. You're just changing the softness of that cone edge. All right, does that make sense? Question? All right, adding color, same way. Now, let's go back and take a look at this. There we go. No. All right, we'll just stop messing with it. There you go. All right, so principles of light. What's the first one? Say again? No, principles. Yep, so we got light direction. Okay, second. Yep, we're going to go intensity. Next. Color. Next. Yep, hardness, or we call it shadow quality. So shadow quality, hard versus soft. Now, when you're dealing with the spotlight, use these first. Go through these in order. Okay? Because if you get your light direction, your shadows will match. Forget the cone, forget the softness of the cone. Light direction, if you match your shadows, your light is in the right position. So usually people freak out with the spotlight. Like, where do I begin? Oh my God. And they start trying to adjust the cone before they adjust the light position. You screw yourself up. So if you have to, make the cone big enough so you can see your whole area, and then just start moving the light and work on just getting the shadows to match. Get your intensity, get your color, get your shadow quality. When you're done with that, for this exercise, you've got 3 more things to look out for. Right? So for the spotlight, number 5 is going to be the cone angle. How much area does that light take up? Next, how soft is that edge? Does it look like it softens inward? Does it look like it softens outward? Honestly, I usually like to go, oh, it looks like my cone is somewhere back here, but it looks like it softens inward a little bit. As opposed to starting in here and having it soften outwards. Same thing here. Looks like my cone is actually out here, but it softens inwards a little. Next, figure out your cone softness, which is penumbra angle. Seven, figure out, well, does it look like my light is pretty even inside that cone? If it is, you might not have much drop off on there, if any. But if it does look like it, you might need to use drop off. And drop off, you're just going to use a tiny bit because it's really going to mess with the cone softness or that penumbra angle. Does that make sense? So that's the process for the spotlight. Light direction, light intensity, light color, get your shadow quality, then go in, what's my cone? What's the softness of my cone? Does my cone light, that area inside the cone, does that look even? Question? Buddy? All right, so what I'm going to do is do a quick demo for workflow for you. I'm going to use the directional light because that's one that we can get done in pretty quick time. Should we do the front or the top? Top? Front? Two fronts? Two tops? Somebody's got to break the tie. Top. We got three. Anybody else? All right, let's do the top light. All right, so first thing I want to do is download the assignment, which is down here. There we go. It's going to drop into my downloads folder. Don't forget, like most of our downloads, you're going to get 3 folders. You've got a Maya project folder. This is what you set Maya to. You've got a template folder. Each light has its own template. Why? Well, because each light's got a couple of choices. You got the area, you got the directional, you've got the point, you've got the spot. If you open one of these up in Photoshop, you'll see we have different layers for the reference images. Just go under render. And if you're not doing this version of the area light, for example, I picked that one, go under reference images, turn off the top, and now you've got the front. Same thing with the directional. So if you're not doing the top, you're doing the front, there you go. Now, a couple of things you're keeping track of besides camera AA and diffuse samples. The intensity of your light. So you're going to start tracking intensity, the render quality, and the time. Now, depending on your light, so for example, directional light, pretty simple. Quit out of Photoshop real quick, just so I don't kill all my resources. You'll notice with the area light, you still got intensity. But with the spotlight, you've got cone angle, you've got penumbra angle, drop off. In addition to intensity, camera AA, and diffuse samples. So the spotlight is the only one that's got extra attributes you have to fill in the template. Does that make sense? So don't forget, keep track of time also. Yes. You can use whatever scene you want to use for your comp, whether the spotlight geometry works better or the other scene works better. Yes. So then it would make sense for you. You don't necessarily have to use the scene file from the spotlight, but you would use the template because it's already got the attributes in it. That way you don't have to try and type them out in another one. So it makes sense. If you're going to use the spotlight, use the spotlight template. If you're going to use a directional light, use that. Area light, use that. That way you've got a similar light requirement for it. Good question. Yes.
For our personal prompts, are we using just one light or do we use
One light only. One light only. Can't tell you how many times people forget that. So if you're not sure, one light only. And also up here, just as a reminder. So one light only. I'd rather have you ask and even email me or message me going, hey, I can't remember. Can I use more than one light? No, ask me. I'll tell you, no, just one light. Because there's no reason to do two lights. We're not dealing with multiple light setups yet. You're only going to try and make it harder on yourself. Yeah, granted, you may be able to match the reference a little better, but that's not the point of the exercise. Point of the exercise is, what can I do with a single light? What can I do with simple geometry? We'll make it get more complicated. When we get into environment, the next my comp you're going to do is environment lighting. And you've got a bigger area and way more lights to use. Like there's no limit on the lights. But let's just go baby steps first. All right, so I've downloaded my project folder. So let's just get rid of that. Let's set project, always set project. Let's go to downloads. So inside my Project2 SAL Arnold, there is my Maya project folder. That is what I select to set. Now, when I go file open or hit the open icon, it takes me right into my scenes folder. So for the area light, directional light, point light, use this scene. For the spotlight, use this scene. So since we're going to demo the directional light, we're going to use this one. So I'm going to go open, and by default, it'll take you into the camera wireframe, just like it did for Project 1. Now, unlike Project 1, where I did all my rendering inside the camera, the render cam, I don't really want to be in the render cam for this, because I want to be outside here adjusting my light, but yet rendering in my render cam in the Arnold render view. Because you're not going to be able to see shadows. Well, you will if you turn shadows on in the viewport, but they're garbage. They are not going to match up with what the rendered product is. So don't bother turning lights on in your viewport. I can't tell you how many times students turn in scene files with viewport lighting turned on, and it doesn't look anything like the final rendered product. I don't know why they do it. They're torturing themselves, in my opinion, because you're trying to force something that's not meant to be accurate. It's not like it's Unreal. You know, you're not going to be accurate, and you could just easily have it done in the viewport, or in the render view, sorry. All right, so this is basically Stonehenge in a bowl. So let's go shaded mode. You'll notice one single-sided geometry turned on for the bowl. That's why we can see through it as the camera, but inside you can't see out. All right, so when you are dealing with light position, always think of the relationship to the camera. You are the camera. You are looking at the subject. Where is the light in relationship to that camera? So when you're out here working, always keep a pretty good idea of, oh, my light's here, or my camera's here. So if I have top light, it's got to be overhead. If I have backlight, it's got to be behind the geometry. Side light's going to be off to the side. Front light's going to be somewhere around where the camera is. Now, we're going to be doing the direction or the directional light. So first thing we want to do, we opened a brand new scene up, is save as. Why save as? Because if Maya crashes, you can at least save some work that you've already started setting up. All right, so let's do directional light. Just going to give it a quick name, 2021-12. Next, select all your geometry and what? Assign a new material, AI standard surface. So you can do it inside the outliner, select the group, shift select the bowl, or just come in and just marquee select the bowl and all the geometry. Make sure you get all the geometry. Shift T brings up the assign new material. You want the Arnold material, AI standard surface. So now every single one of these little pieces has an AI standard surface on it. It's all got the same one, so it doesn't really matter which one you choose to go to the attributes because they all have the same material. So first thing we want to do with a new material assigned is what? Yep, specular weight 0. Next. Yep, base color value 0.5. There we go, perfect. Now we've got 50% gray. Save, why? Because it's Maya. Maya hates you, Maya hates me. So just as long as we understand each other, it's a great relationship. All right, so next, let's go and figure out what we're going to do. So I've got 2 of my 3 elements I need to make something visible. I've got geometry, I've got a camera. Now I need a light. So since we're demoing the directional light, let's create one. There we go. By default, let's render. Let me get rid of all this stuff here. And render. All right, let's go to light here. So let's bring it up. Can't really see anything. Don't forget that we can't see anything because the light is hitting the side of that bowl and it is also skimming across the top of everything. So what we need to do is rotate. Now, before I get too far, I want to bring my reference in. So we provide you with a reference folder. Right here, it's got all the separate images. And since we decided we're going to do the top, this is the one I want to bring in and start getting my light to look like this. So let's bring that in under Arnold Render View, Open Image. My project is set. Let's go in here, directional light, top. There we go, perfect. Now I can start playing with my light. All right, so I know I want my shadows underneath the subject. So just like the sun at noon, think of that. Go outside, sun at noon, boop, right above me. And it helps if you turn IPR back on. All right, so it looks like, you know, this one is under, but this one is not. So we need them all to be under each other. So I rotate it into position. Now, fortunately, with the directional light, it's bright enough where I can see it. But if you're working with a spotlight or a point light or an area light, the intensity you're going to have to crank up so you can see it, so you can get some directionality to your light. So light direction, pretty close. Trying to look underneath. I'm not really seeing too much of a shift under here. Usually what you want to do is check to see how your shadows move and then adjust your light based on that. All right, so light direction, pretty close. Let's go light intensity. Still looks a little brighter. Now this one, if I crank it up to my normal, like 100, that's not going to work. This is a very bright light. So even if I turn it down to 10, that's still too much like a polar bear in a snowstorm. Yeah, it's a little bright. Might be a little on the bright side. So let's try 2. That looks too much on the dark side. Let's try 2.5. Oops. Always make sure you go back to your render. I keep forgetting to do that. So 2.5. Close. Well, let me try 3 for now. So light direction, pretty close. Light intensity, pretty close. What I'm going to do now is try and throw some color in there, and then we'll deal with the shadow. The thing to look out for is you may find yourself getting the direction, going back and forth between the intensity and if there's color, color. Don't be afraid of going back and forth a couple times. You may have to refine it just by, how you adjust the intensity and then what your color is doing to the light. Does that make sense? So intensity, pretty close. Let's do color. Looks reddish. Well, not that red. So like I said, I'm going to drop back my saturation. That doesn't quite work. That looks honestly like it's a little closer to a magenta purpley color. A little too purpley. Let's bring it back this way. All right, so the color is, the hue is not too bad, but to me, it looks like it needs to be a little bit brighter because I'm seeing this look a little more intense than that. So now that I've got color in there, let's see what this looks like. That looks a little bright. Let's split the difference. Looks like I need to tweak my hue just a little bit. All right, now, pretty close, light direction, light intensity, light color. For this, even though those shadows look pretty razor hard, I'm just going to go and adjust my angle to 0.5. And the reason I want to do that is I want to see how it matches the reference, because I think I'm seeing a little bit of softness on that reference, but it shouldn't look all that different. So it doesn't hurt to keep your angle at 0.5 anyway. So got the principles in there, the direction, the intensity, the color, the shadow quality, pretty simple. It's underneath. For this, your render shouldn't take you more than a couple minutes, even cranked up to production quality. You do still need to use denoise, but your renders are going to take a whole lot less time. Because single light source, very simple geometry. Make sense? Questions? So this would be the workflow for pretty much all the other assignments. Now, as always, what you would do is render this out with denoise on, save it out as a multi-EXR, right? Bring it into Photoshop, put your watermark in there, put the intensity, put your diffuse and your camera AA and your render times. All right, questions? Comments? Everybody good? All right. That's all I have for you guys for today. It should keep you pretty busy and out of trouble. Let's see. We got through everything that I wanted to. All right, so let's go to dinner at 5 and come back to lab at 6. I'm going to stop the recording.